One common approach for dealing with software failures is the use of exceptions. And now we'll take a look at what facilities Ruby provides for managing exceptions. To illustrate how exceptions work in Ruby, we turn again to the blog class, and we observe that it critically depends on the date attribute, because otherwise we couldn't compare two entries properly if we couldn't rely on the date attribute being initialized with a proper date. And so what we want to ensure now is that each entry object has a valid date and time object in its date attribute. And the approach we take is to raise an exception unless at date, so the instance variable date, is a time object upon initialization of the entry object. So the solution here is to open up class entry. Remember, we had the attr accessors author, headline, body, and date is the one that we want to work with here. And as we initialize an entry object, we want to ensure that no matter what, date is properly initialized with a given date. Now, if no date is given, we know this to be true because we use a default value of time.now. So there is a time object associated with date out of the box if we don't supply our own date in the initialize call. However, if we do supply a date, then there is a chance that whatever we supply is not a time object. And so we raise an exception, and we can give a string indicating the runtime condition unless date is a time object. And so if we supply the wrong type of object, an exception, in this case a runtime exception, will be raised, and otherwise the initialize method goes through. And so this is now easy to see if we compare setting up a new entry without a date or time specified, and compare this to an entry where we do specify, let's say, an empty string. This will yield a runtime error. So let's modify the entry class and its initializer to raise an exception if the date object is improperly initialized. So we see here class entry is reopened, and in the initialize method we raise the exception, in this case a runtime exception, with the associated information string unless date is a time, and otherwise we assign the initial values as usual. So if I now create an entry with Bilbo as the author and then an empty headline and an empty body, but I leave the date as pre-assigned, we get a regular entry. If I, however, supply an empty string for the date as well, we should get a runtime error. And in fact we do. Here is the runtime error with the improper date string that we have raised here as well. The syntax for rescuing from or catching an exception is very similar to what you know from other programming languages. It starts with a begin block followed by the expression you want to guard against its exceptions, and then you give a number of rescue blocks where you specify what types of exceptions you want to recover from. Here I've given the runtime error as one example, and you can bind the exception object that has information about the exception to a variable e here, and then you can use the variable e or the exception object passed into it to construct a meaningful error message. You can have more than one rescue block depending on what types of errors you want to catch. So here we're addressing a different exception class, the no memory error, and we can also have catch-alls with an else phrase, which allow us to catch any previously unaddressed exceptions